Hello and good evening to our audience in Hong Kong and APAC, and good morning and good afternoon to our audience overseas. Welcome to Art Power Hong Kong and Invest Hong Kong webinar, Why Do Art Business in Hong Kong? Please allow me to introduce myself. I'm Doris Fong, Head of Creative Industries of Invest Hong Kong, which is a government department in Hong Kong that facilitates foreign business to grow and expand their business in our region and in Hong Kong. We are delighted to be the supporting partner of Art Power Hong Kong campaign. And in the next few minutes, I'm pleased to give you a very brief introduction about the art scene in Hong Kong before we start our panel discussion. So if you allow me to share my screen. Okay, all right. I'll start by the vibrant art districts in Hong Kong. The art ecosystem in Hong Kong has developed rapidly over the last decade. Exciting art districts has grown organically in Hong Kong around Central, Soho, Sheung Wan, and Sai Ying Pun area. Another major cluster that has grown rapidly is the South Island Cultural District in Chinatown and Aberdeen. Located in the southern part of Hong Kong Island, it comprises around 15 to 20 local international art galleries and artist studios in warehouse-sized industrial buildings. There are major government initiatives in developing art and culture in Hong Kong. One of them is the West Kowloon Cultural District, which is a 40-hectare waterfront site that encompasses a variety of art and cultural facilities, including the Mega Museum M+, which our speaker Suhanya will tell you more about it later on. And there is also the Museum of Art, which was reopened in 2019 after major renovation, now with much bigger exhibition space. And Hong Kong is one of the largest art markets in auction sales. The annual art fair calendar continues to thrive with international art fairs like Art Basel and Art Central, both happening in March. We also have Affordable Art Fair and Fine Art Asia. And of course this year, because of the pandemic, major art fairs like Art Basel has gone virtual, but with very interesting online viewing rooms and exhibitions on Other favorable factors that make Hong Kong an attractive place to do art business are the simple and low tax structure with no sales tax or import-export taxes, and a high concentration of high net worth individuals. Hong Kong has one of the world's most efficient transport and art logistics network, and world-class international airport providing easy access to regional markets. All these are factors contributing to Hong Kong being one of the world's largest art markets and attracting international galleries, auction houses to choose Hong Kong as the base to expand the Asian market. In the past decade, Invest Hong Kong has supported many art businesses to grow and expand in Asia via Hong Kong, for example, art galleries and art auction houses as well. I'm sure you will learn more about Hong Kong's advantage in conducting art business from our speakers today. And now I would like to introduce our moderator for today's webinar, Professor Derek Collins, Dean of the Faculty of Arts of University of Hong Kong. Over to you, Professor Collins.
Hey, thank you, Doris, and thank you, Invest Hong Kong and Art Power and all of our friends who've made today's session possible. I'm delighted to join you all today. We have a global audience. We have members watching, visitors, viewers watching from Europe, from North America, and certainly here in Hong Kong and elsewhere in Asia. So we're delighted everyone can be with us today. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk in more depth about Hong Kong's continued importance as a leading hub of arts in Asia. We're going to look at what makes Hong Kong an attractive place to develop art businesses and why international players continue to invest in Hong Kong, and a host of other issues that I hope we have time to get to. What we'll do is we'll start, I'll introduce the panelists, we'll start a discussion. I will take questions from the audience, but we'll try and reserve those toward the end. Maybe about 2/3 of the way through, we can shift gears and begin to take questions from the audience. So be thinking about things that you'd like to ask our panelists. We have a wonderful group of panelists with us today. We have Suhanya Raffel, who is the museum director of M+. You might say M+ will be Asia's most important new museum of contemporary visual culture. It will bring together art and design and architecture and moving image of the 20th and 21st centuries. Suhanya has 30 years or more of museum management experience, a vast knowledge of contemporary art and art in the Asia Pacific region in particular. And before coming to Hong Kong several years ago now, she held positions in Sydney, at the Gallery of New South Wales, and before that in Brisbane at the Queensland Art Gallery. Next, we have Jonathan Crockett. He is Chairman, Asia, and Head of 20th Century and Contemporary Art, Asia at Phillips Auctioneers. With over 20 years of experience in the field, Jonathan has worked at Christie's, and then he's run his own art advisory business. And then he headed to Sotheby's in London to become a director and senior specialist of contemporary Asian art before coming to Hong Kong. Jonathan also brings just a wealth of experience throughout Asia to his position at Phillips. And finally, we have Brett Gorvy, founder and director of Lévy Gorvy. Lévy Gorvy is a gallery with spaces in London, New York, and about a year and a half ago, they opened in Hong Kong. And with the aim of making their Hong Kong gallery a kind of a sort of equivalent third arm of their New York and their London galleries. Before forming Lévy Gorvy with Dominique Lévy, Brett was chair of post-war and contemporary art department at Christie's. He spent many years at Christie's, going back to the mid-90s, and he also has, even before that, a very interesting background in art journalism. So we have, between our three panelists, many, many years of experience, and we welcome them today. So the first topic, just to jump right in, and whoever'd like to respond first is fine. Let's talk a little bit about the art ecosystem in Hong Kong. What makes it so unique and full of opportunity? And maybe, Suhanya, you could start if you like.
Sure. Thank you, Derek, and thank you to Art Power Hong Kong for putting this panel together. Very happy to participate, really, because I've been coming to Hong Kong since the early 90s and have watched this city transform, and the speed in which that's happened, but also the texture of the art community in Hong Kong, on whose shoulders we all make our work happen. What makes this ecosystem so unique and full of opportunity? It's been expansive and expanding at a speed that's phenomenal. Coming into Hong Kong and into mainland China, watching the growth of contemporary Chinese art, the design and architecture cultures, the film cultures, it's so rich. And on top of that, watching the development of market, and a market that's been incredibly powerful in the world, and then seeing the need for museum. For me, coming into M+ is essential that we start thinking about our communities, a museum's civic role in building communities, the role M+ will play as a major global institution, already sustaining that voice in the community. And I think the opportunity is that there is such a strong audience here. And by what I mean by here is I mean in Hong Kong, but also in the region. We are, without question, a hub where people come in and out. We're in 7.5 million city, but we know when business as usual is happening, we have 80 million come into this city. Of course, that's not the case now with the virus, but there's no other city that welcomes that kind of visitor into what is now really building a sense of a cultural capital, a cultural ecosystem, and the interrelationships that we all must undertake is about that opportunity. And I feel extremely strongly about the fact that we need to have in Asia a museum of equivalence to whether it's MoMA in New York or the Pompidou in Paris. Because it's when you have institutions, civic, museum, collecting institutions of scale, that you start to really understand the balance around which value is understood, art histories, design histories, architectural histories are also expanded upon.
Yeah, fantastic. Jonathan.
Derek, It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to this discussion. To come to your question, what's so unique about the ecosystem here? Well, essentially, there's nowhere else in the world like Hong Kong, where it has this unique mix of cultural heritage, which is informed by its mixed, history, given the Eastern and Western influences here. It's a place where the history of art collecting has existed for over 100 years, since Hong Kong was first founded, yet where exposure to international post-war and contemporary art has been very limited until very recently. Despite that, there is a huge thirst for art knowledge, art appreciation here in Hong Kong. And this is a city with, well, by some reckoning, some calculations, it has more billionaires here than any other city in the world. Despite this huge concentration of wealth here, though, as of yet, it doesn't yet have a world-class contemporary art museum. Of course, this will change very soon with the opening of M+. But when one considers other, concentrations of wealth around the world in the form of great cities like New York, London, Paris, there is almost a museum on every block. So as a result, people here in Hong Kong have to travel to see the art, or attend the next best thing, which is to come to the auction previews where highlights of auctions in London or New York are being shown, or perhaps attend the commercial gallery shows here. When it comes to the auction market in particular, we've especially at Phillips, we've seen a lot of Western contemporary art, which we've been introducing to our sales here in Hong Kong, and there is an ever-increasing demand for Western contemporary art with our clients here in Hong Kong and across Asia. So there's absolutely a huge opportunity here, and the more Western artists we bring out, I mean, we in fact continue to break world records here in Hong Kong, and I've got quite a good example. I mean, a good example in terms of how global the taste is here. Last July, when we had our 20th Century Contemporary Art Sale here in Hong Kong, we set world records for Daniel Arshan, Ginny Figgis, Claire Taburet, Mad Saki, and Maria Taniguchi. These are American, Irish, French, Japanese, and Filipino artists. So it's a truly global taste that the collectors have here on the ground in Hong Kong. And when the museum, when M+ opens, and exposure to Western contemporary art grows as a result, so too will the market grow and continue to flourish. So that's particularly exciting.
Yeah, I think that is really exciting. Brett, do you want to comment from the perspective of a?
Well, yes, I mean, as a gallerist and a previous auction house person, I mean, for us, when we created our gallery, the first initiative, as you described, was how do we create a third pillar to our business. We had New York, we had Europe, and specifically galleries in London, and Hong Kong was not only an essential, it was an obvious position for us, not only because, as my fellow panelists have said, it's the appetite as well as this extraordinary mix of this ability basically of bringing both West and East together in one place. And we've all referred to both the appetite, but it is this optimism, and specifically, I think it's the speed, the learning curve that we've experienced with collectors and clients. We often talk, we meet a buyer and the buyer becomes a collector. That's really the aim for all of us. And again, if we look at it, again, I think we all feel that the presence of a major museum is essential for that ecosystem. We all rely on each other. I mean, what's wonderful about this panel is, there is not, normally you would see a certain degree of competition between the gallery world and the auction world, potentially with the museum world as well. But I think in Hong Kong especially, there is this generosity of spirit. that has allowed for this very, very quick growth. And I think we all rely on each other, but at the same time, there is this independence in the way that we have approached ourselves. And I think this is what's so exciting. And despite the rioting, despite the COVID situation, we have continued to not only invest very heavily within the region, but commit ourselves even greater. And I think it is this optimism in the belief that not only is there an appetite and a hunger, but there is an audience that is actually far advanced in many ways than their counterparts in other countries.
So let's just follow on that point for just a moment. I mean, I'd like you to speak a little bit more about where we are on the learning curve. As Jonathan said, and as you've said both, of course, there's an appetite. There are billionaire collectors. There are very sophisticated collectors here in Hong Kong. There's also a spectrum, I think, of interested potential museum goers, interested, potential gallery viewers, and ultimately collectors. But there's a group of people with quite a bit of disposable income in Hong Kong that still aren't quite sure how to navigate the art world. So I'm not talking about your most sophisticated clients. I'm talking about what I sense to be quite a large group of people who are very interested in the museum world, very interested in the gallery world, the auction world, and whatever. Where would you say we are on that learning curve as a city? And how do we?
First of all, if we look at the contribution of Asia as an entity or as a unit in terms of the art world, if you look at the successes at auction, we often see between 20-25% of the buying coming from Asia, and predominantly, whether it's Hong Kong or from China, it is ultimately coming from that particular area. Now, that growth has been consistent, and if ultimately, as I mentioned before, my time at Christie's, but also now, we are seeing consistent growth. And actually, what's very interesting is actually the age group, because we're dealing here with a much younger group of potential buyers and collectors than potentially we will see in America or Europe. And that's partly to do with wealth. It's to do with, at what point people are actually comfortable, expending on art, because they've actually now reached a certain point in their own comfort zone in terms of wealth. But we are seeing specifically in Asia, collectors in their 30s, for instance, and young 20s. And I think that also defines the type of art that they're responding to, and the technology and the ease of technology at which the access to this art is available.
Can I just jump in at this point and say the other aspect of this is that there are very, very interesting, and I mean, part of the contribution to the market are the work of artists and makers from Asia and from Hong Kong. Like a very significant part of that energy and the excitement was about contemporary Chinese art and the art that came from this region, Japanese, Korean, Filipino, and to be able to then contextualize that within an international museum context is also to invite and develop audiences and to develop a more mature ecosystem around audience and knowledge. And so for the museum, the work is about informed audience space, developing that's slow, consistent core business for museum. And when M+ opens, to be able to show the Asian story from our point of view, together with key international artists and artworks, is going to make such a big difference to what you were just saying, Brett. The young audience, we've already seen that in the work that we've done at the Pavilion and with our programming. There's no question that the 50% of our audience is from the age of 20 to 40. And that's an incredible demographic for a museum to already know we are tapping into, and they are very keen. That's like a very important part of the work that we're doing, is also acknowledging the great creative content that's come out of this region that often is, part of a diversity story in the international space of Europe and America, but it's core to our story from here.
And I think that's incredibly important, because I think, there's always that tendency to look to the West and to believe somehow that, our job as gallerists has been to bring Western art into this region. For me, me, this is basically a two-way street. It's a conversation that is continually happening. I mean, our team in Asia is run by an Asian-led team. I mean, it's basically, we are the outsiders in a certain way. And it is this understanding that this phenomenal culture, phenomenal artists, and it is about contextualizing, as you described, creating, actually allowing people to see really, full spectrum. And I think that's ultimately, whether it's the art fair, which again is a phenomenal aspect, the Basel Art Fair, if we see the growth, if you go back, Derek, to what you were talking about in terms of how we've seen incremental growth. Every year, the art fair, the expanse of that as a public forum, and this is one of the, in fact, I think it is the only art fair in the world that is sold out. You have lines around the block, basically, for people just to come and see the art. And I think that openness, that accessibility that is available from these platforms, but it's actually the openness of the visitor coming to view and being as open, coming with potentially the knowledge of their own artists, but finding basically that synergy and that ability to basically see a global audience or global world through the art world.
Jonathan, do you want to?
Yeah, no, I to compound on what both Brett and Suhanya just said, there's a huge thirst here, particularly among the younger generation, people in their typically 20s or 30s who are probably, when it comes to buying and selling art at least, well, mainly on the buying side actually, at auction, mainly second generation wealthy Chinese, often who themselves as individuals have little or almost no experience of buying art themselves. That said, quite often they are second generation, and the the first generation, the generation that created the wealth in the first place, are people who have collected art, but only it's been a different type of art. It's been Chinese ceramics, works of art, Chinese ink painting, and if you kind of contextualize the kind of history of art collecting here in Hong Kong, people often overlook the fact that China has the longest surviving culture and civilization globally. It has been, there's been a long history of collecting art and appreciating art for hundreds of years, more than 1,000 years. That said, the focus has always been on Chinese art. It's been looking internally. It's only been in the last, bar a few exceptions, it's only been the last decade or 2 decades where we've seen this exponential growth in interest in Western contemporary art, post-war modern art. And during this time, there's been a huge influx of commercial galleries, the art fair, Art Hong Kong, which then became Art Basel Hong Kong, and to Brett's point about growth being consistent, I would actually say that the growth has been exponential. People here are just becoming more and more and more interested in Western art, and their interest, the growing interest, kind of coincides with the advancement of digital technology. It doesn't matter where you are in the world these days, you can access anything at the tip of your fingertips on your phone. And quite often, what we see here is that there is this thirst of knowledge. There's this demand for learning about the art, and people here are extremely well read. They're very well informed. They're just as likely to know about a young emerging Swiss contemporary artist in Beijing, for example, than someone of the equivalent age in Zurich might be, for example. So I would say that this is a market art market which is, yes, it's got a long history, but it's developing in a way, maturing in a way, which it's becoming more globalized, and really, we're just scratching at the tip of the iceberg. This is just the beginning in terms of the potential for the market here.
I do think that it's also about that cosmopolitan spirit, that Hong Kong has. And the relationship of that internationalism within Hong Kong's spirits is amplified in that kind of, in whether it's the Art Basel context or even now with the museum. And it's very important that that idea of connection is expressed in the various parts of the work that we do.
I completely agree, and I think this has got a lot to do with contemporary culture. You know, Chinese people here in Hong Kong and beyond in Greater China are, you know, exposed to Western culture, whether it is from personal life experience, they've studied abroad, they've worked abroad, they've come back to Hong Kong, or via social media or you know, videos or cinema, film. You know, they're aspiring to a Western lifestyle, which is completely foreign to the lifestyle of the culture here in Hong Kong.
I think education, sorry, I was going to say, I think education here is so highly prized. And I think that's something which, again, is a driving force, not just in the way that we're talking about collectors, you know, assembling information and basically making it their own. And, you know, I always find, again, we talk about, you know, education on one side, but it's also how people are doing business. I mean, the speed of understanding the complexities of the art world and becoming part of it and becoming major players is also a fascinating aspect of this. But it is this, not just the sophistication that you're describing, but also this, you know, the respect given to education. And if I look at our role as a gallerist, and I see it the same with the auction houses and obviously as with M+, it is this very strong role of educators, of bringing not just the art to the region, but bringing the information and bringing basically the context, which again will allow, you know, for the growth of even greater potential.
This is really interesting. I wanted to press a little bit because, you know, people have said that Hong Kong, well, to the extent that the market is driving interest, right? The you know, obviously high prices and all sorts of things. I mean, to the extent that that's driving increased interest in art. There's also this issue about whether Hong Kong is just modeling itself after a New York or a London, or whether it is actually, as you've touched on, the cosmopolitanism and the emphasis on education here, maybe it's actually beginning to sort of forge something different, something new, something unique in Asia. I mean, this would go toward the question that we're going to talk about later about Hong Kong as an arts hub. But could you speak to that a little bit? I mean, it does have a unique, it should have a unique quality and character to it, right? It's an opportunity, it would be, not to just define themselves in the view or in the mirror, so to speak, of New York or London or Paris, but really to think about what's unique about this region and what's unique about, you know, the collectors and the viewers and the museum goers here, that therefore creates a different experience. It's something that we want to draw the world into, but we want to be clear about what it is they're getting. It's different here, right? They're not just buying another piece of art in Hong Kong because there's no taxes, right? I mean, we want there to be more to it than that.
Definitely. I mean, from the M+ point of view, I think the fact that we're a visual culture museum, first and foremost, recognizes within Hong Kong how rich the visual cultural space is in this city. And it's from that root that the museum was dreamed by the first group of the Museum Advisory Committee, you know, in the 15 years ago. So it's understanding that richness within Hong Kong. But for us, the big challenge is to reach to the great big population of Hong Kong, that 7 million that are here, of which we know, say 6.5 million are not yet understanding the power of institution and power of culture and visual culture and art. So that's the opportunity, but that is also hard work and deep work that we need to do to get into the imagination of our community. But as Brett said, education has always been valued. And as Jonathan has pointed out, a deep history of collecting and literati value in cultural life is a basis on which to develop.
I think one of the mistakes that, if I look at, again, the growth of the gallery system within Hong Kong, I think the initial step, and the auction houses, I'm sure were also part of this, was really just trying to replicate, as you described, Erica, basically what we do in New York or what we do in Europe. And it is understanding that, in fact, what we are creating, what is being created in Hong Kong, in Asia, is unique. It is unique in terms of this cross-fertilization between Eastern ideas and Western ideas. It is this hub of activity. It is this entrepreneurial aspect in terms of the character of the personalities as well. So certainly when we approach any idea that we're looking at in terms of Hong Kong, it is unique. It is not trying to just bring whatever we're doing in other regions. It's really thinking about what is ultimately the character of the personalities there, and how do we actually move the pendulum? Because I think we're all part of that idea that we are at a sort of ground level. There is, we're talking about millennials of history, but there is that feeling, and frankly, part of the excitement and the optimism is that we are at the beginning of something great.
So speaking of millennials and younger people, I want to come to technology. You've touched on this in various ways. Technology has made a huge impact in the art world and continues to make one. It's not just that people are using more online platforms of one kind or another. I mean, there's online auctions, there's online only sales, and it just kind of goes on and on. But even if we include social media in that, the way Instagram is being used by individual artists, by galleries, by auction houses themselves to attract new business. Jonathan, I know you have some experience yourself, quite famously, with Instagram attracting new buyers. But I guess I'm really interested in how this is going to continue to play a role, maybe from the point of view of education, but certainly from the point of view of engagement. How do you think about the impact of technology on the art world from your different perspectives? There's as I say, it's really, there are many, many aspects of this, but just maybe take it apart however you like. But how do you think about technology, its role? What are your plans, maybe, you'd like to speak about too in the future? How you might implement technology, even in ways maybe you're not doing yet, but give us a sense of that, because this is a huge area. And as you say, the demographics here in Hong Kong suggest that that online purchases are actually probably a significant portion of the sort of sales happening in Asia here. I mean, in other words, there's a real demand, a real interest and hunger for online access points for the art. I mean,
it was very interesting to see, to your point, that in the most recent auctions that Sotheby's held, there was a Francis Bacon painting that sold in the $86 million price point. It was bid on by an online bidder coming from Asia. A Jean-Michel Basquiat work on paper selling at $15 million was bought by an online bidder from Asia. So again, we are really seeing this as being really Asia leading the field and using these new technologies to their benefit. And I think that's something which, again, it wasn't even a surprise for us. It was something which actually we recognized as being part of the characteristic of what we see.
Yeah, and I mean, this is something which is, it's been developing over the past few years, but it's been kind of accelerated in the last few months because of, COVID-19. We are seeing, we've seen a huge amount of activity coming in the last few months in terms of client interaction with us digitally, compared with last year and going back. To the extent that we've had, we've been forced to change our the way how we interact with our clients, and clients instead of being able to come in and see us physically, we're flying to go and see them. They've resorted to, and we have resorted to, interacting with them digitally, whether it's on on the phone, in a Zoom conversation like this. WhatsApp, WeChat, Instagram chat, whatever it might be, it's happening a lot more now digitally.
Are we prepared for this? I mean, does more work have to be done to really make the best use of this technology?
I think, interestingly enough, sorry to interrupt, because I think it's funny how, I think this is already, we've been developing this as a gallery, and I think the auction house is there. And I think one of the reasons why it's been so swift, because of, COVID has accelerated everything, but ultimately that shift which happened for us in March. And it wasn't just the fact that we had the technology was there and actually we were using it, and the art fairs have moved completely into a virtual world. It was the fact that actually the consumer was used to it. It was actually, if I look at the older generation and trying to teach people how to use Zoom, that's been the sort of joke of this kind of moment. But to see on the other side how quickly technology has been part of the language, actually, and it's partly that notion of access. How do you ultimately get this huge amount of information that's basically circulating at all times? And I think, first of all, the younger generation obviously has an ability and a comfort zone in working with that. But certainly the industry has been directing this, certainly in the last 10 years, towards digital and how do we use this technology. And again, from the museum world, it's a similar thing. If you watch ultimately what's happened under COVID, you can go to most museums still and go into sort of a virtual reality of those museums, but there has been a continuation. And in fact, one of the most amazing things about this COVID period, we have only, it's really been in the last 2 weeks where we've actually had to go into shutdown in Hong Kong. We've ultimately been able to remain open, compared to galleries in New York or in London or in Europe. We've been able to basically continue ourselves throughout this whole process. And it is in conjunction with an online presence.
I would add that, it's just to take a little step back, that it was in Asia that big communities became, started to be digitally alert. So very, very early in Korea, in mainland China, in Hong Kong, in Singapore. So to see this step into that world it's absolutely natural. How we in our various institutions respond and think about what is the digital relationship. I think, with the COVID situation, I've watched many, many museums do lots of things online. And I think there's an opportunity to really rethink that and think a little bit more carefully about how you actually tailor make and reach out to people. Perhaps the commercial world has done that more effectively because of a transactional relationship makes that a very clear avenue. But I think as museums, because we are civic in our reach and we think about broader publics, we need to think about how we attend to our patrons and our members as distinct from a general public member, and how we develop a knowledge base and to service them. But it's an ongoing thing. And I think the other thing to say is that digital world is evolving also so fast. Learning about new softwares, what are the capacities, and that's something as an institution we're very interested in relation to practice. What are artists doing with it? What are designers doing with it?
I was quite taken by some of the recent auction sales in June and July, and for example, what Christie's One did and what Sotheby's did. Everybody's sort of experimenting in this space, but it does open up the question: are there different ways of doing things online? Are there different ways of engaging with people, maybe even presenting the work you do, and through technology in an exciting, new, and engaging way? I don't know what you think about that, but I just think that it's about the opportunities. It's about what, and maybe you yourselves don't necessarily have the resources to invest and to explore, but there is an opportunity there, and maybe that's something we should be encouraging. Tech startups. I mean, Hong Kong is, Invest Hong Kong, and it wants to be a kind of knowledge innovator, maybe even an idea incubator. We know Sun Jun is right across the border. We know they're a tech giant, but we should be able to leverage, either on the hardware side of things, but leverage that in connection with our own ideas for maybe how to engage or present, whether it's museum work and public engagement, or whether it's the commercial side of things in a new way.
No, but I think that is the most exciting aspect you're describing, because I think we are seeing this entrepreneurial aspect where, I mean, as I described earlier, how many people knew about Zoom before ultimately went into COVID. So I think there's so many new ways that we are trying to engage clients. But it is that combination, and I do think it's incredibly important to say, is that, there's nothing quite like the physical, relationship between, actually standing in front of a work of art, having the presence of a work of art. And I think a large part of what we're, as all of us are trying to do, is finding that balance between how do you create the real experience of being, whether it's in a museum, whether it's in an art gallery, whether it's in an auction house, how do you have that same experience? And if you can't have the experience of standing in front of the work of art, how do you at least create something which is a augmented experience, right? That doesn't take away from necessarily that amazing thing, that magical experience that happens in front of a work of art, but ultimately adds to what you can have. And again, obviously necessity creates opportunity, and I think that's ultimately what's happened in the commercial world.
I can say that from our perspective, yes, there is the relationship to the object is paramount. We all value that intensely, but we've also begun at Implus to commission digital artwork, and our first digital commission was with the artist Miao Ying, who did a very wonderful piece that's still available online for people to go and see, which is called Digital Detox, and using the Great Firewall in mainland China as a lure to say, well, all of us if you've just overloaded with the digital world, come in and have a digital detox. So, it's good to have that kind of playfulness and a reflection as well in terms of what does digital mean to us in our living reality.
And so I'd say that, this is a time when, we are globally being forced to kind of adapt to more digital ways of engagement with here in Hong Kong and across China in particular. I think people are more receptive to it, perhaps, than anywhere else in the world. And this isn't something that has just happened recently. It's something we've seen and experienced over some time now. If I just think of auction catalogs, for example, nobody in China wants us to send them the catalogs because they're quite happy just to look at everything on their phone. So it's something which here in China, in Greater China, in Hong Kong, people just seem to be very receptive to and adapt to very quickly.
And it is that comfort zone, because as you were talking, I remember being in an auction room back in 2016, when watching my Asian colleagues basically communicating with their colleagues through WeChat, basically during a live auction, using their phones, basically not only to show what's happening in the auction room, this is before ultimately the Summit of the Technology was there, but writing them in real time, basically. And there was this, there was an engagement that was possible between someone who was sitting in New York, literally in the live auction, and someone who was in Greater China. And yet there was this, speed of communication and action, and, whether that person bought it, but it was just the ability to see how technology was being used, even in just, a one-to-one communication, which was so different to what we were seeing with our American or European colleagues doing.
Sure. Well, let's shift gears a little bit and take some questions from the audience. But the first one actually speaks to an issue that I was going to ask you anyway, which is to think about the future of Hong Kong as an arts hub. It's been a challenging year in Hong Kong, not just because of COVID and pandemic, but also because of the larger political environment and the relationship with China. And so the question that we have really right off the internet is what is the future of Hong Kong as an art trading center? Okay, so an arts hub, but also more specifically an art trading center, given the imposition of the national security law in Hong Kong, which just happened in June How do you think about that? How do you each position yourselves? Obviously, there's a lot that's unknown. Even at the university, our distinguished law faculty is working to try and parse the language of the law and really understand its implications. But from an art perspective, art world perspective, from where each of you sits, how do you think about this? How will this impact art business, or just arts engagement in Hong Kong?
Let me start, because I'm a public institution, a civic arts museum, and it is early days, and we're assessing it. You know, it's only a month in, and in a context that is, you know, Hong Kong has always had a very, very strong ability. It's kind of the environment here has allowed us to do so much, and I think it's on. And we build on that. For InPlus, of course, we have always had a very strong, robust, curator-led approach to all of the work that we do, research and academic research and thinking structures, all of that. And we continue to build that. We don't think that that's, well, at this point, we're certainly not going to say that that's going to stop. That is the basis of our work, and that we believe that it's the independence of curatorial voice is utterly core to the business of the museum. And, you know, I look to the governance of our institutions as a way of managing that. And we have our own InPlus board, but the West Kowloon Cultural District has an ordinance, and that ordinance states very, very clearly, and I'll read it, to uphold and encourage freedom of artistic expression and creativity. And our obligations also include, and they're statutory obligations, that include the development of new and experimental works in art and culture to enhance and promote excellence, innovation, creativity, and diversity in the arts and in culture. So that's our mandate, and that's what we intend to do. That's our position at this point.
Jonathan?
Yeah, no, so, I mean, to Suhanya's point, it's still early days, and there's been a huge amount of debate and speculation about Hong Kong's future as a financial centre. You know, the city is a city which has been built on trade and commerce, and of course that includes the trade of art as well. But generally speaking, people seem optimistic when it comes to financial analysts. They most you know, general consensus is that the newly implemented national security law will have limited impact on financial transactions and capital flows. You know, local currency can be freely exchanged with any international currency here in Hong Kong, where money can be sent or transferred to any country around the world. Mainland Chinese companies continue to raise funds in Hong Kong. We've got Jack Ma's Ant Group IPO happening soon, for example, which could be the world's biggest ever flotation. So, you know, financially, things look very rosy here. And traditionally speaking, when the financial markets are strong, the art market is also strong. So from my perspective, I remain quite optimistic.
Similarly, I think and you describe it very well, because I think at the end of the day, I think you know, traditionally Hong Kong has been this extraordinary hub and this transactional center. And you know, it reminds me actually about a lot of the conversations that were had in London about, you know, the place of London in the art world in the 90s, and when they were going to bring in certain taxes which ultimately could be against the you know, the market there. And ultimately, at the end of the day, what was important was that the culture there, first of all, wanted to be an important place within the global market, but ultimately, you know, every decision was made understanding the economic impact of it. So I think, again, as we've said, you know, this is very early days. We haven't really seen any true impact from this, from these new guidances. But I think the optimism that you're describing is really what we're seeing. Ultimately, that there is the feeling that this is a great place for trade, and that it is, historically, but it will continue to be the place where the whole of Asia will come together for whether it is auctions, whether it's private sales, or whether it's for museums. Ultimately, this is going to be the cultural center.
There's another aspect of this question which has to do with creative expression and creative freedom, which is, some galleries are concerned about they want to protect their artists. Museums, Suhanya for sure needs to be thinking about the kinds of exhibitions it does. We're all worried a little bit about self-censorship in this respect. In other words, will we not do things that we should do, that would be brave and interesting to do, for fear of crossing some invisible red line? And so I guess, do you have any thoughts about that, just from the point of view of public engagement? I mean, will we not be able to do exciting, provocative exhibitions because everyone's just too afraid?
No, I don't think so. But I think well, I don't know, but at this point, I don't think so. Because I also want to talk about censorship in terms of museums. Censorship has been felt by museums across the world in very different contexts. I know in Australia, when I was there was an Andreas Serrano exhibition at the National Gallery of Victoria that in the end had to be taken down because of a whole group of people who objected to it on religious grounds. So, that's an act of censorship. There was even more recently at the Guggenheim in New York, the Art in China post-89 show, of which M+ loaned a third of that exhibition to New York. And it went on to San Francisco, and 3 works had to be taken down because that exhibition couldn't continue if those works were on display. So the issue of censorship is something that institutions, museums are always having to face and negotiate. And I think this is another instance of thinking about that relationship between your public. We obviously we can't break the law. No institution breaks the law. And, we work within the jurisdictions of which we exist. So I just think we need to think carefully about what censorship actually means when we are having to practice exhibition making, public programming. But I don't think that we need to feel fettered by that. We can still make the expression, have the conversation, and consider what we want to say in an institutional context in terms of programming.
I think it's also how artists react to these situations. I think we're not just talking about censorship, it's about, what ultimately creates dialogue as much as anything else. And I think what often happens at these times is, art becomes richer, art becomes much more pertinent to its times. So I think at any time of crisis, whether it's COVID, whether it's financial, whether it's ultimately political concerns, it does engage artists in a different way. And I think that's another aspect which I find very exciting about, what we're going to see coming out of this period is going to be a very rich, layered aspect in the way that artists are responding to our society.
Yeah, I completely agree with what Brett just said. I mean, if you look back not that long ago, not even 30 years ago, to the early 1990s in Beijing, following the Tiananmen Square incident, for example, you had a huge amount of creativity coming out of mainland China with the so-called cynical realist artists, the likes of Zheng Fanzhi, Yue Minjun, Zhang Shaogang, for example. And that period lasted 15 years. In terms of huge amount of creativity, and so yeah. But what happened? This, as we say, this is early days, and so the coming years ahead are going to be, I predict, quite exciting in terms of artistic expression here in Hong Kong.
Yeah, I think, and in the region, and I know because we have the SIG collection, which has the authoritative collections of contemporary Chinese art, of which that period is one of. It dates back to the early 70s. So I think that's part of the history making that's happening.
You know, maybe this is a dimension of the same topic, maybe not. But Jonathan, both Phillips, you as well as Christie's are tying up for your next auctions with some of the largest mainland auction houses. So, for example, you're tying up with Poly and Christie's with China Guardian. I'm not suggesting that's a political move, but I wanted you to comment on that because it is interesting, the timing of that. Is that just an opportunity that you'd like to explore? What would you say about that?
Politics has got nothing to do with this whatsoever. The reason why we're doing this essentially is now is because we feel the time has come for us to establish a larger foothold within the Greater China market. Poly is the leading auction house in mainland China with the longest operating history there. They have a very large client base there, and a large infrastructure on the ground in terms of offices, staff, etc. We, with this collaboration, are able to tune into that immediately at the flick of a switch, we will be advertising and building our brand presence in China via their infrastructure, just as they will be, reaching out to our more global client base in order to build their international brand and global brand recognition.
I think community is really a very important word. I mean, we started by talking about the sort of the ecosystem that exists, and I think that even COVID in a way has accelerated some of these things. But I notice how we as a gallery, as an international gallery, are working alongside the local galleries. How do we actually strengthen the community? And I think it's the same thing here. It's basically looking at ultimately as a gallery, how are we extending our footprint, but at the same time, how are we also working within the community?
Yeah. No, I think this is such a really timely and interesting issue, and because it is actually about engagement, and it is about broadening one's audience and one's collector base. And as you say, we're such an important node in this whole region that it only makes sense to further strengthen our ties with art lovers in mainland. There are a lot of questions coming in. We've touched on many of them already, but there are a lot. Here's one that's a little bit different. What do you think corporates, so MNCs, but also POEs in Hong Kong can do to help the art scene flourish? So it's timely in a way because sometimes whether we're talking about private funding or corporate funding, concerns given the current environment about that, some sensitivity maybe around the kinds of activities that corporates have done before, but not to make it a political question. What do you think corporates could do more of to help the art scene flourish here in Hong Kong, which again helps all of us?
From a totally selfish museum point of view, no, I mean, it's very interesting to see where philanthropy and patronage sits in Hong Kong. It's very developed in health, in education sectors, but cultural philanthropy is still very early, and that extends into the corporate sector as well. And I think it's really important that corporate citizenship is extended into the cultural space, whether it's funding artists' works through commissions or supporting museums to commission artists to make things. I think it's really important because that's when that ecology really starts to develop. We've seen the development of the market. We're starting to see museum and major institutional development, but it also needs that relationship with philanthropy, collectors, corporates coming into the space as well, whether it's working on a prize, support prizes. There are many ways that the corporate sector can help. And I think especially now, it's artists who are really finding it hard to survive, and especially in performing arts space, actually, because there's very little opportunity to earn your living. So I think it's a key part of support to go right to that heart to support the makers. None of us would be doing the work that we're doing in cultural space if the makers weren't making.
I mean, they are really a key part of the ecosystem, and especially in a city like Hong Kong, right? So
especially,
to almost call upon them,
yeah,
maybe more fervently than we might otherwise. Certainly, long traditions of this exist in Europe and in North America, without question. I mean, many museums and galleries and the local art community are supported by whether corporate or private sponsorship. And I think maybe that's also part of the learning curve, right? To help them understand what's really at stake, because what's at stake is really much larger. It's not simply an investment with a short-term payoff, but it is actually, fertilizing, you might say, the ecosystem, that kind of support.
Yeah.
I think, one of the things which has been a major characteristic in Asia has been the notion of the private foundation, patronage coming from a private individual versus necessarily, obviously supported by state, but it is something which has been a major factor when we think about the Long Museum or, many institutions which ultimately have been created on the back of one individual or one family. And I think it is that combination of private patronage and how do you ultimately encourage that? Because that obviously is the most important support system that often is behind a museum. It is an individual.
Yes, that's right.
And then, the add-on of that is the acceptance, or at least the state supporting that and allowing for whatever the tax advantages potential for doing that. Because I think, again, if we look at ultimately the growth of the infrastructures that we've seen in Europe and America, it has been through private patronage, but supported by governments that ultimately saw, the giving towards the art institutions as something which had tax benefits for those individuals. And I think that's something, again, where we saw, actually some museums, specifically in America, losing some of their patronage was because of change of laws in terms of taxes. So again, I think it is about, again, it's an ecology. It's basically how do you ultimately balance all these things at once.
Hong Kong doesn't have a lot of private museums. Do you expect to see more of those? That's a really
I think the large problem is space. I think if you talk to individuals who had ambition of creating private foundations and private museums, a large part of it is actually just the physical nature of where do you put these spaces, versus in mainland China, where you have obviously much greater opportunity for space.
And the cost of that space.
Sure.
Yeah, exactly.
Sure. Well, we're almost out of time. I really want to, I want to make sure each of my guests has an opportunity to add any final thoughts or any closing thoughts. It's been a wonderful hour, but do you have anything you'd like to leave your audience with before we sign off? We could talk for another hour. There are many more things we could talk about.
I would like to just say for us, for M+, when we open next year, for me, it's really important to think about it as part of the return of the city back to its, full glory post-virus. I just think that we do need to think about life post-COVID, or how we accommodate living with the virus into the future. And we do need to have high points. And I just think M+ will be one of those key moments next year when we open, that it's really a staking claim for the city as being a key cultural capital.
Fantastic.
And for me, just to come back to the topic of the original kind of question, the title of this conversation, why do art business in Hong Kong? Really, when it comes to Hong Kong, if you combine it's got a lot going for it. If you combine its free trade status, its comprehensive legal system, the kind of low levels of corruption here, the free port, the low tax, the reliable infrastructure, its strategic position, at the gate as the gateway to China, which is fast becoming the world's richest economy. I think we can safely say that Hong Kong's future as an art hub is secure for a long time to come.
Brett?
I totally agree, and I think it is this commitment that we are all making as businesses, as part of a community to this region, and I think that's ultimately, if I look at ultimately, any decision that we have internally as to what we're doing, it's always the notion: how do we bring best to this region? It's not about ultimately bringing a compromise situation or a secondary kind of idea in terms of the art we're bringing. It's really the premier aspect of a lot of our focus. And I think that is very, very important in terms of what that future is. If you look at the gallery system and how quickly it was grown, and you have H. Queen's building, you have the Pedder building, you've got galleries such as ourselves where we have individual spaces, but it is that continuation, throughout lockdown, throughout ultimately, the last year, we have brought and continue to bring the best of the art that we can do to the region. We have a whole reveal system with major Basquiat paintings currently on premises. And I think that is really, if I look at what Phillips are doing, or look at what M+ is doing, it is that total commitment to the region. And I think, as we've said, as we come through this, and whether we have to live with COVID or whether ultimately this is going to be something that, when the vaccine comes, there's going to be, this will be from the past, but it is the building blocks that we're seeing currently, and whether it is moving into technology or whether it's ultimately this community working together in a much more cohesive way, I think that is really the most positive aspect of what we're currently experiencing.
I think that's a fantastic summary of really the state of Hong Kong, and also just what's going on. I'll just add that it's, I mean, in a way, Brett, it's what you said. It's not just that we're aspiring to do well. We're aspiring to do absolutely world-class work and in what we do. And it's for all these reasons, for that shared commitment, that I think we're achieving, and we're going to continue to achieve in ways that other cities, can only envy. I think Hong Kong does have something unique about it. I think it has something special. And I think it is absolutely, bar none, one of the most exciting places to do business of many kinds, but certainly in the art sector. So I really want to thank you all today for making the time. Brett, especially, I know you got up really early for this. It's still probably just 7 a.m. your time. But, and thank you to our viewers for tuning in. I want to thank Art Power Hong Kong in particular for helping to put this together. I'd like to thank Invest Hong Kong for helping to sponsor today's presentation, Sinclair Arts for helping to manage the communications. But finally, and most importantly, to our speakers for joining us today. So thank you very much. And I hope to talk to you all again soon.
Thank you
you
very much.